Assalamu alaikum to everybody present here. First of all, thank you for having me, Miqdad and Jamil sir. Thank you so much for bringing me on over here. Just a little bit, just a brief introduction on my research that I do. This is not my main research that I do, but it is something that I picked up as one of my interests, and I've written a couple of pieces on it, which I found extremely interesting. Is this good? Perfect. Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. So I'm originally from India, from the town of Mangalore, which is close by to the town of Bangalore, if people know that town. Uh, but I grew up in the UAE for a while, and also I did my undergraduate there. I studied Arabic in Yemen for a while. Then I was in Singapore, which is essentially where I started my research on security, on extremism, on terrorism research. I focused both on the Middle East as well as on South Asia, particularly on India. My research basically covers a few broad themes. Number one, I look at security research, which is what this presentation is about. I also look at political Islam, which is what my PhD right now is on. And finally, I look at foreign policy, which is something that I do: Indian foreign policy, Middle Eastern foreign policy, and so on. And I look a little bit into Middle East politics as well. So the idea that the topic, this topic, climate change and its impact on security, was something that I found very fascinating a few years back when I started out, like when I used to engage with a lot more with security based research. Why is it that this topic, I want to talk about why is it that I reached this point of doing this research? Essentially, I think I was traveling in India at some point, and I realized I was in a heat wave. It was quite bad, and I was just trying to understand what's happening over here, right? And obviously, like as kids, when at least in my generation, when we grew up, there was this whole discussion of, okay, environmental change, global warming, we need to do this, recycle, reuse, reduce, so on and so forth. And we never really thought it was something that's close by. We just thought, okay, whatever, it's like 100 years later or something. But after a while, we realized that when I was traveling, I realized, oh, this is what they were talking about when I was like 5 years old or 10 years old or whatever, right? And you realize that the impact of climate change there's a very direct impact that we all get to see. Heat waves, and that's where we're talking about. You talk about the rise in temperatures. We're talking about climate aberrations that are taking place I think in London it snowed last year in December. I was here on that day, so unfortunately, but it's as far as I was told, that's a little bit rare in London, and these sort of things start moving around in a lot of places. You know that a lot of cities are sinking right now. I think Jakarta, New York, a lot of places closer to the beach, they are at the risk of being flooded. Venice, I think, there was these famous visuals of a lot of flooding that actually took place over there, and people were actually surprised. But to be honest, it isn't in some ways a surprise as well, because we know that this is what climate change is leading to, at least directly speaking, right? You also have floods, storms, you have heat waves, you have last year London was, I think, 40 degrees, was it? It's almost reached that, and that's unheard of as far as I understand in this country, right? So we can see that there is an impact to us directly, and the way I started thinking about it was, I started wondering, all right, so this impacts society, and a lot of security research that I do, a lot of groups that I study, whether it's militant, whether it's violent extremist, whether it's non-violent extremist, and sometimes they're bracketed politically as terrorist groups, right? A lot of these groups essentially work on on recruiting people, or on burnishing their credentials, on declaring that they are a good group, they are a useful group, based on the fact that people are upset in their society for whatever reasons, right? So it's a way for essentially providing an alternative narrative towards whatever happens in society. And I realized that climate change is going to really impact that narrative that exists, because you will have this position where governments will be unable to, or they will be struggling under the weight of trying to deal with the sort of impacts of climate change, and that is not going to be a great thing for society in general, where you'll have a lot of people becoming disenfranchised, becoming upset. the impact of climate change is also going to be felt more, disproportionately by people from a poorer background than from people from the richer backgrounds, as well as people in this part of the world, especially in the what is called as the global north, or like the western parts of Europe and in the US, are actually going to be less affected as opposed to places in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and so on. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that is. I'm not an expert on that topic, so I'm not going to get into it. But it just made me think that there's something more. There's like, there's a story over here that we probably don't know, and we probably won't realize after a while unless we actually start looking at it. And so that's why I wanted to do this research, and that's where we are with this. So this may not be, I wouldn't say that this is the deepest or the best research that I've done in terms of like, there are topics that I've done a lot more research on, but I also feel that this is one of the most important and like, impactful researches that I've done so far, right? And so that is where I start this presentation, essentially talking about the brief typology of groups. You talk about militant non-state actors. For example, you have groups like, the Islamic State, so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, was a militant non-state actor. It was obviously designated as a terrorist group by many members, many arms of the UN and many countries overall. But at its core, that's how we look at it as conflict scholars, as security scholars, right? And then you have what is obviously also called as violent extremists. I mean, again, these movements like ISIS, they are also violent extremists, but sometimes they're not militant in nature. That depends on how much, how organized they are as an army, so to say, right, or an insurgent group. That's why they're more militant, and whereas those who don't have such access to arms, they are more of violent extremists. And then you have what is called as non-violent extremists. So the far right normally comes into this bracket, and we have a lot of that over here in the West at this point, right? So this is, again, the brief typology of groups we're looking at. What do they do? How do they recruit, essentially, if you look at all sorts, and there's this whole narrative of like, religion is responsible for violence and war and so on and so forth. I mean, any conflict scholar or any security scholar worth their salt will tell you that that's really not true, and it really depends on the different dynamics that exist in society at their, within that society, right? So what happens is that you have, people drawing on, or these groups drawing on disenfranchisement and discontent, right? They create a narrative of the current world where they say that, for example, you can take, I'll just give you an example of England, for example, of the UK. Oh, the NHS is breaking down right now, the trains, there's strikes every other day, the universities are like striking at this moment. What is the government really doing here? So that is a narrative that they can create of the current, country that you are in. And then they say, let's offer you a solution. Why don't you join our group? We are here to like, change things, and that can be both non-violent but also largely violent as well, which is why then there is a threat to security that exists in these places, right? Apart from offering a large solution for problems, a lot of terrorist groups, a lot of militant groups, a lot of non-violent extremist groups as well offer redemption. They tell you that if you join our group, and especially in Islamic terms, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive you for all your sins that you did before. So don't worry if you were a gangster or whatever. You can join us. You're going to be fine. You're working towards the cause of Allah. And it's not just Muslims, but you also have a lot of other religious movements and non-religious movements that also talk about this. They say, your past life is what you did before. Now you join, you take up the good cause, and in whichever terms, it's your karma will get better if it's Hinduism or Buddhism, but also like in Christianity, you can use these frameworks in pretty much any religion, or even secular atheistic frameworks as well, right? Also, they give identity, they give social acceptance to people. So, for example, someone's been feeling like so many problems, I don't know what to do, nobody seems to be addressing it at this point, and then you have that one, for example, you have these environmental groups that are talking about the climate and speaking about the topic, right? They are telling you, okay, we are going to do something about climate change right now. We are going to protest. We are going to stand in front of all of these oil companies and tell them to get down right now and stop their activities, so on and so forth. So they feel like, there's some identity here that they're offering to us at this point, and we want to join them, right? So this basically plays a role in recruiting people, and B, it also plays a role in making that group a strong group, so to say, right? And so this is where, you can think about how climate change then basically plays a role, right? What it does is these same factors that I've talked to you about, it just exacerbates everything at this point. It acts as a force multiplier, right? So when you, for example, when we as citizens, and I'm coming from India, where huge societies at this point, large societies at this point are, and it's not just the poor, but also rich societies, are having acute water shortages at this point. You have like water mafias that are created where people with tankers are coming in from like outside the city, and they just like liters and liters of water. You have to buy it, to basically do all of your daily duties and so on and so forth. Obviously, when you have water shortages, agriculture gets affected after a while. And as societies, as sometimes as urban societies, we don't tend to think of these aspects as well. But, once you get agriculture getting affected, then you have what, I don't know if you all experience this over here, but the egg shortages, right? Like this was happening in the UK for a while, at least while I was last traveling, which was a month or two back, right? And this disenfranchises citizens. People start, like, food security really starts affecting, and water security really starts affecting, people and their daily livelihood, right? So that is something where we will see, and as I will show you later, there is a lot more impacts, a lot more deeper impacts as well. Apart from, what climate change does to like these shortages, you also have what it does is it induces disasters as well. You have a lot more, there are certain, for example, areas across the world where the number of cyclones, the number of storms, the number of floods have increased quite significantly. And the reason, the reason that is because temperatures have changed, wind patterns change from there, and then, the possibility of like cold and warm air mixing together, creating cyclones, all of this stuff increases significantly, right? And in terms of security, again, this slide, what I'm trying to do is trying to show you that once climate change impacts these things, it also impacts security in a specific way. So when you have it affecting, for example, inducing disasters, then what happens is that it does not allow, the government has to do relief work, but also non-government actors can do relief work, which include a lot of, non-state militant actors, violent actors. And that basically reduces the state focus over here, right? Lastly, and this is a very important, especially for this part of the world, and I'll be covering it more in one of my case studies. We have the issue of irregular migration, where because of the disproportionate impact, because of the fact that cities will be sinking and others will be flooded, and the heat waves are like temperature is going to go up in many places, people move out of their places and they move to like other parts of the world, and definitely the West is going to become one of those places. So how does that impact security and extremism? Well, xenophobic hate crimes. Think anti-immigration sentiments that take place, which is so rampant right now in the West, right? So these are like, when I was trying to understand how climate change starts impacting security, I started thinking about this as a framework, like the underlying factors that, it starts impacting. So let's look at, the two case studies that I've brought up here. So I've brought up Yemen and I've brought up Germany. Yemen is something that's already happened. Germany is something that there is a lot of potential for, but there have been like, past precedents because of which I wanted to talk about it, right? So, everyone's following so far. It's okay. Like I hope I'm not speaking too fast. If I do, please stop me and let me know, all right? In terms of Yemen, all right, so Yemen has a long, complicated history. I've lived there. It's a very beautiful place. It's essentially, it was divided into two nations, South and North. There was one republic, and there was the democratic, one republic, and I think the socialist, part of Yemen as well. And I believe by 1990 they essentially united. So, but after they united, there was still a lot of tensions, and that resulted in a civil war, which took place, I believe, in '94. You had at that point Abdullah Ali Saleh, who was this strongman ruler who sort of like ruled Yemen for over 3 decades. And he actually supported many insurgents who returned from Afghanistan in the 1980s. So as you may or may not know, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and a lot of Muslims from across the world went into Afghanistan, and they were supported by the US, they were supported by many Western nations to fight against the Soviets, because the Soviets were the enemy at that point. A lot of these alumni, so to say, of Afghan, they're called the Afghan alum actually, in security terms. So a lot of them returned back to their own nations with ideological, clarity, with arms training, and also with like global contacts, right? And then they set up a lot of different militant groups in their own cities. So that's why you've had Al Qaeda in Yemen, which started out, that's how Al Qaeda in Yemen started out. Even in Bangladesh, even in Pakistan, a lot of basically even in Egypt and so on and so forth. So Al Qaeda essentially grew very slowly over decades, and in 2011, in fact, they actually took over one of the northern towns. I think it was Saada, I believe, in Yemen. And then what happened was they were kicked out in a year or so, but they actually like governed a city for almost a year, which gave them a lot of governance experience as well. And then by 2012, I think they were kicked out, and then in 2015, Yemen had a civil war. Like you started out with a civil war, and again, I was sort of there to witness it at some point. And essentially, what they did was they capitalized on it. So again, like I said, Yemen's based into like two different parts. So you have north and south. It's actually north and south from the Kaaba. That's why it's Yemen is actually to the right of the Kaaba, right? But essentially, you have what is called as Shimalis, the North Yemenis, and then the Hadramis, that's Hadramaut region. So in the north is where the main fighting took place, the civil war, and Al Qaeda was more based in the south. So because the military and the army were all focused on the north of Yemen, a lot of Al Qaeda was able to sort of capitalize on the fact that there's no security anymore in the south of Yemen, and that's where they started. They ended up taking up the town Mukalla, which is a port city. They captured it and they again controlled it for a year, and they earned a lot of money. I mean, we're talking almost like the group, as an insurgent group, they earned about $2 to $5 million a day from taxes, because Mukalla is a really important port, port city, and so a lot of ships pass by that. So essentially, when you take over the administrative structures over there, you are able to take in, a lot of money at that point, right? So that was, that's just a brief introduction of Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Then I'm now going to talk to you about now how climate change has been impacting Yemen, right? So in climate change research, there is what is called a slow onset impact and rapid onset impact. So slow onset is where you have like, temperatures are increasing slowly, you have this, sea levels are rising and so on and so forth. Whereas in, rapid onset, you have the disasters, right? So how did this affect Yemen specifically? Over the last 20, 30 years, water supply has reduced significantly in Yemen. So there, just for like scale, per person, the volume of water that each person has access to is 86 cubits, whereas I think in the UK it's 2,200 cubits. So that's almost 20 times more that we have access to over here. Also, what happened is that rising sea levels increases the salinity of existing aquifers. So where they draw their fresh water from, because rising sea levels have started seeping into these areas. The drinking water started becoming salty. And I remember when I used to do my wudu there, the water was quite salty. It was very difficult to actually gargle your mouth, right? At the same time, temperatures and heat waves have increased significantly. And all of this has led to food shortages as well, because you don't have enough water to take care of agriculture, and on top of that, topsoil has been eroded. We know about this, when trees are cut, they're not holding onto the soil, so the soil starts leaving after a while, right? So this is some of the slow onset impacts of climate change. Whereas you had what is called as the rapid onset, where you had increasing cyclones. So both in 2015 and 2018, two freak cyclones, aberrations in the climate, normal climate patterns, they occurred. Increased rainfall occurred in certain areas, and there is this island called Socotra, which is, it's said that it's a world, it's almost like from another world. It's like an alien world if you go there. A lot of their unique fauna started getting destroyed because of, all these problems that started occurring, right? And over time also, some of the houses got destroyed as well. So I think if you noticed in this photo, these houses are to be honest, they're very beautiful in northern Yemen especially. They were among the first skyscrapers of the world, which was built before, I think, even before Islam, came to Yemen, right? So they're very pretty. And a lot of this, heritage is being destroyed at the moment. So, given that, okay, now I've taken two completely different things. I've taken Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and then I've taken climate change, right? So how did they actually intersect with each other? Was it like direct or indirect? And I'd say it was a mix of both. So, in 2011, essentially there were letters written. I don't think this was found out in 2011. It was later, much later, that the security forces came across these letters. But leaders of Al Qaeda were actually sending, instructions to each other, talking about how important it is to preserve water and to provide water to the citizens of Yemen, right? Where they knew that this is a problem. And like I said, at the end of the day, these militant groups, the way they grow is that they are able to tap into existing, dissatisfactions, and that's where they are able to pull them from there. And also because they ruled in 2011, they gained a lot of experience. So what they actually did in 2015, when they took over Mukalla in Hadramaut, is they commissioned building of water infrastructure and wells, right? Like specifically wells, water infrastructure, and so on. And they were so serious about it that they threatened, contractors with death if they did any corruption in this matter. So yeah, it's very interesting to see that this is normally what they would have reserved for their enemies a lot of times. So if they say there's a spy, they kill them immediately. If there is, someone who's reporting to whatever, like Western agencies and stuff, they kill them immediately. And this is what the same punishment that they promised, contractors, if they weren't doing the work right. So this is how important they took, right? And over time they actually built it. Like, and not just that, they also built a lot of phone, infrastructure as well for like phone services, communication, telecommunication services. After some time, they also started launching food distribution campaigns. And it's not just the fact that they launch food distribution campaigns. A lot of militant groups definitely do things like this, but they also started publicizing a lot of it on Twitter at that point. This was in 2015, 2016, and so on. And the idea was that they wanted to let people know that, look, we're here, we understand that you all have a shortage, we are trying our best to provide you with this. So we're not those bad guys that the US is trying. So this is the message that they were trying to push out over there, right? And finally, Cyclone Chapala happened, which was in 2015. And Al-Qaeda was actually the group that was responsible for evacuating a lot of people from, disaster hit areas. They helped with relocation, and they also helped with food and relief and so on. And again, we need to reflect on the fact that, of course, we are here in the UK where, things are really stable in terms of government, despite the crises we're facing. But this is a country, Yemen is a country where governance has always been an issue for, decades at this moment, right? And you don't have any functioning government almost in the south. Like, people have tried, but it's not been that great compared to maybe up north in Yemen, right? So the fact that they came in and offered a structure, they offered this, the stability to sort of say that, okay, fine, we're going to take care of you, don't worry about it, right? And that immediately allowed, put a lot of citizens to rest, which is why people joining Al-Qaeda in Yemen at that point, in that 2015, after all this happened, it was not considered oh, they're joining a terrorist group. It was, for the locals, it was more of oh yeah, they're joining the one group that's making a difference over here, right? And this is how essentially you can see that where you had climate change taking place, where you have all these slow onset and rapid onset impacts of climate change, it helped improve, burnish credentials for what has been designated as a terrorist group by many Western countries, right? And it essentially, for a while at least, it increased recruitment as well. And it increased their significance, right? So in insurgency, what we study as insurgency theory, there is something called the Battle of Hearts and Minds. The US military tried to use it in Iraq. Obviously, they failed. But the idea is that any insurgent movement draws its strength from the population. So if the population does not support it, then it's not going to be able to move things forward. And that's why here Al-Qaeda sort of did all of that. They did that because climate change gave them that opening to sort of step in and do these things, right? So this is something that I talk about when I talk about climate change. But I will now go on to the next case study, which is on Germany, all right? Now, it's not happened yet, thankfully, but there have been a lot of small patterns which, when we bring it together, we can see that things can go quite bad, even in the West as well, where you think that, oh, we have functioning government, so how is it that this might impact us here? So in December 2022, I don't know if you all are aware of this, there were around 20 arrests of what is called, I believe, the Reichsbürger movement. I'm sorry, please forgive, I'm not a German, so I don't know the pronunciation, but essentially it's citizens of the Reich, which is, citizens of the Republic, I believe, right? They tried to, are people aware of this, that there was a coup attempt in Germany? They actually tried to like kidnap like a law minister or something like that. So, the prominent civil society members were actually arrested. This, in the photo, this is one of them. I think he was a judge or like no, he was the main intellectual architect of this whole coup. And, ex-military, there were like teachers who were arrested and so on. So this was one group, it was a very extreme group, but then obviously like it's part of the right-wing spectrum that exists in Germany, right? So you have, for example, the Alternative for Germany, it's called the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, but it's translated into Alternative for Germany. They entered politics in 2013, and by 2017 they actually became the third largest political party. They ran their campaigns on anti-immigration, which bordered on conspiratorial at some points, and also on Islamophobia. And according to some of the existing research, a lot of hate crime increased because of the political, rhetoric that was being deployed at that point, right? So what was the causes of growth? I mean, if you look at some of the causes of growth, I mean, Germany, like the UK and like many other parts of Europe, are also facing rental crisis. Right now, if you try to there are properties that are booked for 2 years in a row. People actually are like, okay, I'm going to pay you for 2 years in a row, just get as a property. You have the energy crisis, which has exacerbated quite significantly after the Russia-Ukraine war. And you have a medical crisis where a lot of people from, their version of the NHS is striking as well. And you have what is called also the refugee crisis, which has been ongoing since the civil war started in Syria, right, which is 2015, 2016, and so on. So all this has led to discontent with the government. And, there's also this other aspect of they don't like the EU, European Union, this the far right, right? They don't like that our sovereignty is being dictated by somebody in Belgium at this point, right? So all of these essentially is allowing them to put out their message or tell people that, look, we are here, we are going to give you a different vision altogether. We're not going to be subservient to the rest of Europe or the European Union, or we're not going to allow these refugees to come in, these Arab refugees, whatever, or African refugees, or so on and so forth, right? And so this was the basis, this is what existed, right? And then you enter, climate change, right? You have and this is where I'm not saying that things have already happened, but I'm saying there is a lot of scope for this to happen in Germany. You have what is called as this category of climate refugees. It's a hazy category, but essentially it's this term for people who will be forced to relocate from their countries because of climate change, right? Because of heat, because of so on and so forth. And according to a lot of UN reports, currently there are almost 20 to 40 million of them. People have actually left and it's already started. It's not like this is coming in the future. By 2015, the forecast says 1 billion. I don't know if that's exaggerated or not. I'm not an expert in the methodology, but essentially that has also existed, right? And those forecasts exist. So the largest number of climate migrants or climate refugees, so to say, will be from South Asia, from the Middle East, and from Africa. And the expected flow is going to be into Western Europe. Literally this one small continent is going to be where everyone comes in. And, Germany is definitely going to be one of those destinations, right? Essentially, when you think about a lot of far-right groups, literally everything is blamed on, immigrants. Oh, these immigrants are coming here, the government can't do anything about this. So this is where, a lot of that hatred is being fanned a lot more, right? So you can imagine a future where there's going to be maybe 10, 20, 30 million refugees trying to enter for whatever reason. And you can imagine sort of anti-immigrant and also Islamophobic, narratives that are going to be spreading around at that point, right? So you have that, and that's why you can see that for a fact climate change is going to impact all these conversations. And obviously the example has been of Syrian refugees. The moment they entered Germany, there's been so much of a debate in the country, and because of that, it's always been a problem for them, right? So with that, I'm reaching the time as well, so I'm just going to conclude over here. There have been proven instances of climate change impacting how militant groups and also non-violent groups, have impacted, have increased their presence. There's a lot of potential for damage. All sorts of groups benefit normally, but it's not a direct cause. It's not like, okay, climate change is going to happen and then you have an immediate impact. Although there are case studies that exist in Pakistan and even in India for that matter, where climate change has directly affected militant groups and their survival. But essentially what it does is it challenges the structural integrity of governments. So it's an invisible force that is going to essentially move, a lot of non-government, movements, which can be violent as well, to sort of improve and increase the standard in standing in society, and then recruit people, and it could get bad as well. So this is something to think about. Essentially, this is an intellectual exercise that I also wanted to point out. In that, when we think of climate change, it doesn't just impact the normal things that we are dealing with. I mean, there's climate change and its impact on finance, on so many other issues. I haven't really gone into it, but there is a lot on diseases and so on and so forth, right? So this is one more of those sub studies of climate change that people should be looking at and people should be thinking about generally, which is why we should probably be a lot more concerned. I mean, apart from the normal reasons, right? So yeah, with that, I end my presentation, and we're open for questions and answers. So yeah, thank you.